I didn't cry when my daughter-in-law packed my things into cardboard boxes. I didn't say a word when my son handed me a form and pointed to the signature line at the bottom. I just looked at him, really looked at him, the way I used to when he was 7 years old and had done something he knew was wrong. He didn't meet my eyes. That was the last morning I spent in my own home. My name is Loretta. I'm 69 years old, and for 41 of those years, I lived in the same house on Clover Ridge Drive in Asheville, North Carolina. I raised 2 sons in that house. I buried a husband from that house. I planted roses along the front fence that still bloom every May, even now, without anyone to tend them. I was not confused. I was not frail. I had a bad hip that slowed me down on stairs, and my doctor had mentioned my blood pressure twice in the past year. That was the whole of my medical history. I drove myself to the grocery store. I balanced my own checkbook. I read the newspaper every morning with my coffee and did the crossword in ink. None of that mattered on the day my son Arthur sat down across from me at my own kitchen table and told me he was worried about me living alone. He had a pamphlet. He printed it out and folded it in thirds like a piece of mail. Meadow Creek Senior Living, photos of women in cardigans playing cards, a porch with rocking chairs. He slid it across the table toward me like he was making an offer I couldn't refuse. I told him I wasn't interested. He told me he'd already put down a deposit. I remembered the sound the refrigerator made in that moment, that low, mechanical hum that I'd heard 10,000 times and never noticed before. I heard it then. His wife, Pamela, was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. She'd been standing there since they arrived, not sitting, not helping herself to coffee the way she used to, just watching. She had a certain look on her face, patient, like she'd already decided how this was going to go and was just waiting for me to catch up. Arthur told me it was just temporary. He said he only wanted me somewhere safe while they looked into some options. He used words like peace of mind and professional care and what's best for everyone. He did not say what everyone meant. He didn't have to. 2 days later, I was in room 14B at Meadow Creek. They took my car keys. They told me it was facility policy for new residents, that they'd reassess in 30 days. 30 days came and went. Nobody reassessed anything. I had my clothes, my Bible, a framed photo of my late husband Gerald, and a small television I almost never turned on. My phone, a basic Android that Arthur had given me 2 Christmases ago. They let me keep, but the Wi-Fi at Meadow Creek was slower than anything I'd ever used, and half the time the calls dropped mid-sentence. The first week, I was mostly in shock. I ate my meals in the dining room and smiled at the nurses and did not make trouble. I watched the other residents and I thought, I am not like them. And then I felt guilty for thinking it, because some of them were wonderful people who just had the bad luck of getting old in a country that doesn't quite know what to do with you once you do. There was a woman named Frances who'd been a high school principal for 30 years. She did the Wordle every morning on her tablet and could still recite Shakespeare from memory. She'd been at Meadow Creek for 2 years. Her son visited on holidays. Frances was the one who told me I should get a copy of whatever papers I'd signed. I told her I hadn't signed anything. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. They didn't have you sign a power of attorney? I said I didn't remember signing anything. Arthur had handed me several forms the week before I moved in. He'd said they were for insurance, for the facility paperwork, for Medicare supplemental coverage. I'd signed where he pointed. I hadn't read every page. I should have read every page. Frances didn't say that. She just nodded slowly and went back to her puzzle. But that night I lay in my bed in room 14B with the parking lot light coming through the gap in the curtains, and I understood what she hadn't said. I needed to see those documents. The difficulty was that I had nothing. No car, no easy internet access, no one in my life I trusted completely. My younger son Derek lived in Phoenix and called me on birthdays. We'd never been as close. I had friends in Asheville, my neighbor Bet, women from my church, but I didn't know how to start a conversation that began with, I think my son may have taken my rights away. I started small. I asked one of the day shift nurses, a kind young woman named Gail, if she knew how I might request copies of my admission paperwork. She said she'd check. A week later, she brought me a folder. I sat on my bed and went through it page by page. There it was. A durable power of attorney, signed in my handwriting, dated 3 weeks before I moved in. It gave Arthur authority over my finances, my medical decisions, and my property. There was also something called a deed transfer form that I didn't fully understand, but that had my signature on it and his name on it and the address of my house on Clover Ridge Drive. I sat with those papers for a long time. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I don't say it to seem strong. I say it because I think some part of me had already known, and the knowing was almost a relief. At least now I understood the shape of the thing I was dealing with. I started thinking about what Gerald would have done. Gerald was a practical man. He was a plumber for 35 years, and he approached every problem the same way. Find the source, stop the leak, repair the damage. No drama, no wasted motion. He used to say, "Loretta, panic is expensive." I heard him saying it then, in that little room with the parking lot light, and I almost smiled. I needed a lawyer. The challenge was getting to one without Arthur knowing. He called every Sunday evening and sometimes midweek. He asked careful questions about how I was eating, whether I was sleeping, whether I'd been talking to the other residents. He was doing what he thought was due diligence, or he was checking that I was staying in place. Maybe both. I learned not to mention anything that might make him think I was becoming a problem. I asked Frances if she knew anything about legal aid. She did. She wrote a name on a corner of newspaper and passed it to me like we were in middle school. Legal Aid of North Carolina. They had a line for seniors. She'd used them herself 2 years ago when she'd had a question about her own situation. She said they were real people who actually answered the phone. The problem was the phone. My calls at Meadow Creek weren't monitored. They told me that, but I wasn't entirely certain I believed it. And in any case, I didn't want to have that kind of conversation in a room where anyone might walk past my door. There was a small garden courtyard in the middle of the facility. Residents could sit out there during the day. The signal wasn't much better than inside, but it was private enough. I started going out there every morning after breakfast with my coffee and my phone, and I sat at the far bench near the rose bushes. They had roses, isn't that something? And I made my calls. The first time I called legal aid, I sat on hold for 40 minutes and then the call dropped. The second time, I got through to a woman named Rosa who was a paralegal. She listened to me describe my situation without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Mrs. Loretta, I want you to write down everything you just told me, with dates if you can remember them. I said I could remember them. She said that was good. She said that power of attorney documents can be contested, particularly when there's reason to believe the signer was not fully informed of what they were signing. She used a phrase, undue influence, that I wrote on the inside cover of my Bible, because it was the only paper I had that Arthur couldn't accidentally flip through. We spoke 4 more times over the following weeks. Rosa connected me with a supervising attorney at their office, a man named Theodore. Theodore was direct. He told me the deed transfer was the more complicated issue because property law moved slowly and my signature was on the document. But the power of attorney, he said, had some vulnerabilities. Arthur had presented documents to me under circumstances that could be characterized as pressured. I had not had independent counsel. There might be a path. Theodore asked if I had anyone on the outside who could assist, someone who could receive documents on my behalf, someone Arthur didn't know. I thought about it for several days, and then I called Derek. I hadn't wanted to involve Derek, partly because I'd always tried to keep the peace between my sons, and partly because I was afraid he wouldn't believe me. I was afraid he'd call Arthur and tell him what I'd said, and Arthur would come to Meadow Creek and explain to everyone that his mother had become confused and difficult. But Derek surprised me. He didn't say much while I talked. He asked a few questions. When I was done, he said, Mom, I knew something was wrong. I've been waiting for you to tell me. He flew in from Phoenix 10 days later. He didn't tell Arthur he was coming. He met with Theodore directly. He became the point of contact for all the legal correspondence because his address in Arizona was somewhere Arthur had no reason to look. It took 4 months. I want to be honest about those 4 months because I think people imagine that once you have a plan, the waiting becomes easier. It doesn't. There were mornings when I woke up at 4 o'clock with that particular kind of dread that sits on your chest and won't move until you make it move. There were Sunday evenings when Arthur called and I had to talk to him normally, ask about Pamela, ask about the grandchildren, and say nothing about what was happening. I became a very good actress in those 4 months. I also became a different kind of person than I'd been before. At home, on Clover Ridge Drive, I had spent 30 years making sure everyone was comfortable, making sure dinners were on time and opinions were soft, and conflict was managed before it started. Gerald was not an easy man. He was good, but not easy. And keeping a household humming had been a full-time occupation on top of my actual full-time occupation, which was working in the billing department at Mission Hospital for 22 years. I had spent a lot of my life making myself easy to overlook. At Meadow Creek, in room 14B, I stopped doing that. There was nothing left to lose by being exactly who I was. I started a small reading group in the common room on Tuesday afternoons. Francis joined immediately. A man named Howard, who'd been a civil engineer, started coming after the second week. We read whatever anyone brought. I had opinions about the books. I stated them out loud. It turned out I had a lot of opinions I'd been keeping to myself for decades. Arthur came to visit in March. He brought Pamela and the grandchildren. We had lunch in the dining room and he told me I looked well. He said Meadow Creek was turning out to be a good fit. He said he'd been looking into making my room a permanent placement. I smiled and passed him the bread rolls. 3 weeks after that visit, Theodore called Derek to tell him that the power of attorney had been successfully challenged. The court had found sufficient grounds to rule it invalid. The deed transfer was still being contested, but Theodore was cautiously optimistic. I sat in the courtyard with my coffee and my phone, and I listened to Derek's voice reading me the details, and I thought about Gerald. I thought about the roses on Clover Ridge Drive. I thought about Francis and Howard in the common room on Tuesdays. I didn't feel victorious. I want to say that plainly. I felt tired and clear-eyed and something I might call determined. The house was not resolved yet. My life was not back. But something had shifted in a way that couldn't be unshifted. What happened next was not something I had planned. I've always had a particular habit. Every time I'm in a drugstore or a grocery, if I'm waiting in line, I buy one scratch ticket. Not because I expect to win. I've never expected to win. But because Gerald started it when we were first married and had very little money. He said it was $1 worth of hope, and we could always afford that. I kept doing it after he died. It was a small continuation of something. At Meadow Creek, I hadn't been able to do it. No car, no drugstore, no line to wait in. In April, Derek drove me to a CVS to pick up a prescription. My first time leaving the facility without an approved facility transport in 6 months. And I waited at the register while he pulled the car around, and I bought a scratch ticket. A $5 one. Gold-colored, with stars on it. I put it in my coat pocket. I forgot about it for 3 days. When I found it, I was sitting at the courtyard bench with my coffee, early morning, before the other residents came out. I scratched it with a dime from the bottom of my purse. I looked at the numbers twice. Then I looked at the numbers twice. Then I looked at them again. I called Derek. He didn't believe me at first either. He drove back to Meadow Creek and sat beside me on the courtyard bench and looked at the ticket himself. Then he looked at me. The ticket was worth $187. I know that's not $62 million. I'm not telling you it was soapus. What I'm telling you is that it was enough. Enough for a good attorney. A private one, not legal aid, though I will be grateful to Theodore and Rosa until the end of my life. Enough to contest the deed transfer with full legal firepower. Enough that when Arthur called on Sunday evening and I told him, in a calm voice, that I had retained independent legal counsel, and that I would be returning to my home on Clover Ridge Drive, there was a silence on the line so complete that I could hear him breathing. He said, "Mom." I said, "Arthur, I love you. But what you did was wrong, and you know it was wrong, and now we're going to fix it." Another silence. I waited. I'd gotten good at waiting. The house matter was settled out of court 4 months after that. Arthur signed a quitclaim deed reversing the transfer. I'm not going to tell you what was said between us in the attorney's office that day, because some things belong only to a family, even a broken one. What I will tell you is that Pamela did not come to that meeting, and that afterward, Arthur sat in the parking lot in his car for a long time before he drove away. I watched him from the window. I moved back to Clover Ridge Drive on a Thursday in September. Derek flew in to help. My neighbor Bet had kept an eye on the place and had even watered my roses twice during the summer. Some of them had made it. The house smelled like itself. Old wood and the particular dust that belongs only to a place you've lived in for decades. I stood in my kitchen and ran my hand along the counter, and I thought, I am home. Francis and Howard sent me a card. They'd found my address through Derek. The card had a blue bird on the front, and Frances had written inside, in her neat hand, "We miss you on Tuesdays. Don't forget what you figured out in here. I haven't forgotten. Here's what I figured out. For whatever it's worth to you, when you make yourself small for long enough, you stop being able to see your own size." I had spent so many years smoothing things over and stepping back and not wanting to be difficult, that I had nearly let someone take everything from me without making a sound. The nursing home didn't break me, but it forced me to stop managing everyone else's comfort and start managing my own survival. And in doing that, in those Tuesday afternoons and those courtyard mornings and those phone calls made in secret, I found out that I had never actually been small. I had just been standing in a crouch for so long that I'd forgotten how to stand up straight. I stand up straight now. My hip still gives me trouble on the stairs. I still do the crossword in ink. I still buy one scratch ticket when I'm waiting in line, not because I expect to win, but because Gerald said it was $1 worth of hope, and he was right. Some mornings I drink my coffee on the front porch and look at the roses, and I think about Frances doing her Wordle in room 11, and I think about all the women and men sitting in facilities right now who are exactly as clear-eyed and capable as they've ever been and who no one is listening to. And I think about what Frances said to me the first week, the thing that started everything. She didn't tell me what to do. She just asked the right question. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone asking the right question. If you're sitting somewhere right now and something feels wrong, if someone has told you that you're confused, that you don't understand, that it's better if you just let them handle things, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to ask for the papers. You are allowed to read every line. You are allowed to call a number in secret and say, "I need help." You do not have to make yourself easy to overlook. You were never small. You just forgot. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since I moved back into this house, not in any grand philosophical way, just the plain practical kind. The kind you learn when you finally stop looking away from the consequences of your own choices and other people's choices and the place where the two collide. Arthur didn't wake up one morning and decide to be a villain. I don't believe that. What I believe is that he made a series of small decisions, each one easier than the last, that added up to something that couldn't be undone quietly. He decided it was easier to manage me than to talk to me. He decided that a signature obtained under confusion was still a signature. He decided that my comfort was less important than his certainty, and each of those decisions produced a result. That's not judgment. That's just arithmetic. What I also know is that I made my own decisions that led me to that room at Meadow Creek. I had spent decades making myself agreeable, making myself manageable, handing people the tools to overlook me because being overlooked felt safer than being difficult. I had confused keeping the peace with keeping myself. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is exactly where I got lost. The $187,000 scratch ticket gets attention when I tell this story. People want it to be the point. It isn't. The point is what I did before that ticket, in the months when I had nothing but a phone with a weak signal and a woman named Frances who asked me one careful question. The ticket gave me resources. The attorney gave me a path, but I had to decide, in a courtyard at 5 in the morning, with nobody watching, that I was worth the fight. That decision was mine, and nobody could give it to me, and nobody could take it away. That's the thing about dignity. It isn't something other people grant you. They can take a lot from you. Your keys, your signature, your house, your daily routine, the particular smell of your own kitchen in the morning, but they cannot take the part of you that decides to pick up the phone and dial. That part belongs entirely to you, and it's more durable than any legal document. I think about Frances still. She's still at Meadow Creek, last I heard, still doing her Wordle, still asking the right questions of whoever needs to hear them. She had more taken from her than I did, and she chose to use what remained, her sharpness, her experience, her willingness to pass a name on a piece of newspaper to someone who needed it, to be useful anyway. That is its own kind of triumph. If I could say one thing to anyone sitting where I was sitting, in a room that isn't yours, in a situation that was designed to make you feel small, it's this: intelligence doesn't diminish with age. Wisdom accumulates. The steadiness you've built over 60, 70, 80 years of living through hard things is real, and it is yours, and it is more powerful than anyone who wants you quiet will ever admit. You don't have to accept the story someone else is writing for you. You are allowed to pick up the pen,